Hello and welcome. Tonight we descend into the quiet spaces where divinity bleeds into mortality, where gods betray their own children, and where love between immortal and mortal births only tragedy. The tales you are about to hear do not speak of glorious ascensions or heroic triumphs. They whisper instead of demigods who never chose their nature, of goddesses murdered again and again for the crime of serving faithfully, of primordial sisters whose hatred predates creation itself, and of mortals elevated to godhood against their will. These are the whispers of the whispering eye, the uncomfortable truths about what it means to carry immortal blood in mortal veins, to inherit purposes you did not design, to become pawns in cosmic schemes that span millennia and care nothing for individual suffering. The night before a god dies, he plants seeds in the dark, not in soil, not in the celestial plains where divinity flows like rivers of starlight, but in the flesh of mortals who will never understand what grows within them until the hunger begins. Baal, the Lord of Murder, knew his end approached during the time of troubles, when gods walked toral as flesh and blood, vulnerable as any creature that could bleed. In those desperate hours before mortality claimed him, he made a choice that would echo through generations, a choice that condemned hundreds of children to lives steeped in violence, confusion, and the terrible weight of inherited divinity. You need to understand what happens when a god fears death enough to scatter fragments of his essence across the world. You need to feel the cold certainty that moved through Baal's immortal consciousness when he foresaw Sirach's blade ending his existence. The Lord of Murder did not accept oblivion. Instead, he wandered across Faerun in the years leading up to the time of troubles, seeking mortals of nearly every race, every walk of life, every corner of the realm. Human women in small villages, elven maidens in ancient forests, even giants and dragons, all became unwitting vessels for his desperate plan of resurrection. These unions were not born of love, or even lust in the way mortals understand such things. They were calculated, purposeful acts of divine preservation, each one planting a sliver of Baal's godhood into an unborn child who would carry murder in their very blood. The children who emerged from these unions were called Baalspawn, and they numbered in the hundreds across the breadth of Toral. Each one carried within them a fragment of their father's divine essence, a piece of his portfolio of murder and death that pulsed beneath mortal skin like a second heartbeat. But you must grasp the true nature of this inheritance. These were not demigods in the traditional sense, not beings of overwhelming power who straddled the line between mortality and divinity with ease. Each Baalspawn possessed only a tiny fraction of Baal's total essence, spread thin across hundreds of lives, diluted by mortal blood and mortal limitations. They were neither fully mortal nor truly divine. existing in a twilight state that brought them little comfort and much suffering. The essence manifested differently in each child, though certain abilities appeared commonly among them. Some ballspawn discovered their heritage early, plagued by violent dreams and urges they could not explain or control. The essence granted them abilities beyond mortal ken, powers that whispered of their dark parentage. Resistance to cold and fire flowed through their veins, as if death itself could not touch them with winter's chill or flame's burn. They healed with unnatural speed, their wounds closing faster than those of ordinary mortals, flesh knitting together so long as life remained in their bodies. Some developed immunity to poisons, their divine blood burning away toxins that would fell others. Their very blood could become weapon, coating blades with venom drawn from their own veins. Enhanced strength beyond their apparent physical form, abilities that echoed their father's dominion over death. These gifts marked them as something other than entirely mortal. But the most terrifying manifestation of the ballspawn essence, the one that marked them irrevocably as children of the murder lord, was the slayer form. Within each of Baal's progeny lurked a monstrous transformation, a shape of nightmare and slaughter that represented the purest expression of their father's divine avatar. When the ballspawn called upon this power, their bodies twisted and reformed into something no longer humanoid, something designed solely for killing. Massive claws erupted from their hands, capable of rending flesh and bone with terrible ease. Their skin hardened into natural armor, deflecting blows that would shatter steel. Strength flooded their limbs, multiplying their physical might until they could tear through their enemies like parchment. In this form, a ballspawn became a living engine of destruction, an avatar of murder made flesh, hulking and bestial, and brimming with murderous intent. Yet the slayer form exacted a terrible price for its power. Each moment spent in that monstrous shape drained the life force from the ballspawn, burning through their constitution with relentless hunger. The divine essence consuming its mortal vessel from within, as if the fragment of godhood could not truly coexist with flesh and blood for long. Many ballspawn feared this transformation, recognizing it as both their greatest weapon and the clearest evidence that they were not meant to exist, that their very nature violated some fundamental law of being. The slayer was not a gift. It was a brand, marking them as abominations born of a dying god's desperate gambit for survival. Baal's plan did not end with merely fathering children across the realms. The children themselves were vessels, temporary containers for fragments of divinity that would eventually be reclaimed. The Lord of Murder designed his resurrection with cold precision. When the ballspawn died, their fragment of divine essence would be released, freed from its mortal prison. But Baal did not intend to wait for his children to die of old age or accident. He engineered a mechanism far more certain, far more in keeping with his portfolio. The Baal spawn were created with an inherent hunger, a drive toward violence and murder that would inevitably turn them against one another. They would hunt each other. They would kill each other. And with each death, the surviving Baal spawn would absorb the essence of the fallen, growing more powerful, accumulating more fragments of their father's divinity. This was the true horror of being a child of Baal. You were born not just with the capacity for murder, but with the purpose of murder woven into your very existence. Your siblings, scattered across the world, most of whom you would never meet, were simultaneously your greatest threat and your path to power. Each Baal spawn represented both danger and opportunity. To grow stronger, to fulfill the destiny encoded in your blood, you needed to kill your brothers and sisters and take what lived inside them. The fragments would consolidate, coalescing in fewer and fewer vessels until only one remained. One final Baal spawn, carrying the full measure of Baal's divine essence, would become the perfect vessel for the murder lord's return to life. Based on what we know of divine resurrection, that lone survivor would either ascend as a god themselves, becoming Baal reborn, or be consumed by the essence, allowing their father to reclaim his divine form and his throne in the pantheon. The timeline for this dark harvest was originally short in Baal's vision. He expected the Baal spawn to find each other quickly, to succumb to their violent natures, and begin the killing within a generation. But reality proved more complex than even a god could predict. Many Baal spawn never learned their true heritage. They lived and died as mortals, taking their fragments of essence to whatever afterlife claimed them without ever knowing what they carried. Others discovered their nature, but resisted it, fighting against the urges that whispered in their minds during moments of anger or fear. They sought peaceful lives, tried to bury the murder in their blood beneath layers of civilization and restraint. Still others embraced their heritage with terrifying enthusiasm, becoming serial killers, warlords, or worse, reveling in the power their divine parentage granted them. The hunt truly began in earnest during the years following the time of troubles. In the decade after Baal's death at Sirach's hands, organizations formed with the sole purpose of finding and killing Baal spawn, gathering the divine essence for their own purposes. Individual Baal spawn of exceptional ambition, like Servak Anshev, hunted their siblings systematically, viewing each kill as a step toward godhood. The iron crisis that nearly destroyed Baldur's Gate was merely a means to an end, a plot designed to destabilize the region and create the chaos Servak needed to murder his way to ascension. He understood that the path to divinity was paved with the corpses of his brothers and sisters. The mothers of the ball spawn, those mortal women who bore the gods' children, rarely understood what they had conceived. Some never lived to see their children grow, dying in childbirth, or soon after from complications no healer could explain. Others raised their offspring in confusion and fear, watching as their sons and daughters exhibited abilities that marked them as different, dangerous, touched by powers beyond mortal comprehension. A few mothers knew exactly what they carried, having been aware they lay with a god. But even they could not predict what their children would become or the fate that awaited them. These women were the first victims of Baal's scheme, used as vessels for a plan they had no part in designing, bearing children who would likely die violent deaths in service to a father most would never meet. The Baal spawn themselves grew up with a burden few could articulate. Even those who did not know their heritage felt the wrongness inside them, the urges that seemed to come from somewhere outside their own will. Many struggled with violent impulses, finding themselves drawn to bloodshed in ways they could not control or understand. Dreams plagued them, visions of murder and death that felt more like memories than imagination. Based on accounts from those who survived the Baalspawn crisis, some heard whispers in the dark, voices that could have been their father's influence, or simply the echo of divine essence asserting itself against the constraints of mortal flesh. They were born into a war they did not choose, soldiers in a conflict that predated their existence, pawns in a divine game of resurrection where the price of failure was death, and the reward for success was the obliteration of their mortal identity, consumed by the god they would become. The tragedy of the Baalspawn lies not in their power, but in their powerlessness. They did not ask to be born. They did not choose to carry fragments of a murder god inside them. They did not volunteer to hunt each other in an ever-narrowing spiral of violence and death. Baal's children were victims of their father's fear of mortality, tools created for a single purpose without regard for their own desires, dreams, or right to exist as individuals. Some fought against this fate with everything they had, seeking ways to purge the essence from their bodies or suppress the urges that drove them toward violence. Others accepted their role and tried to find meaning within it, hoping that by controlling the hunt, they might somehow redeem the curse of their birth. A rare few transcended their nature entirely, using their powers in service of good, or at least in service of their own moral code, refusing to let their father's plan define who they became. But the essence did not care about individual choice or morality. It existed to return to its source, to reconsolidate into full divinity regardless of the cost to its mortal hosts. The Baalspawn could resist for a time, could build lives and identities separate from their heritage, but the essence remained patient, immortal in its own way, waiting for the moment of crisis or weakness when the slayer would emerge and the hunt would resume. You cannot escape what lives in your blood. You cannot outrun divinity when it flows through your veins, waiting for the opportunity to reclaim what was scattered. The consolidation of Baal's essence took decades longer than the god anticipated. The Baal spawns scattered across too vast a territory, hidden among too many populations, existing in too much ignorance of their true nature for the quick resolution Baal envisioned. But time means little to divine essence. It waited in the blood of its vessels, patient as only immortal power can be patient. One by one, the Baal spawn died. Some fell to their siblings in direct combat, the essence passing from victim to victor in a flash of dark power. Others perished in unrelated conflicts, adventurers meeting their end in dungeons or battlefields far from the cosmic drama they were part of. Still others lived full lives and died of age, their essence finally freed to seek new hosts or return to the scattered remnants of Baal's consciousness. The end game played out in the great Baal spawn crisis, when the most powerful of the gods' children converged in a final, terrible confrontation. Amelisin the Black-Hearted, a priestess of Baal who had manipulated Baal spawn for years, sought to claim the consolidated essence for herself, fusing it to her own soul in a bid for divinity. She nearly succeeded, becoming so infused with divine power that she proved exceptionally difficult to destroy, while the essence remained within her. Only another being carrying Baal's essence, only a fellow Baal spawn empowered by the deaths of their siblings, possessed the strength to strike her down and claim the final fragments. When the last confrontation concluded, and all the essence finally reunited in a single vessel, that Baal spawn faced a choice that would determine not just their fate, but the murder lords as well. What happened next remains a matter debated among scholars of divine resurrection. Some accounts suggest the victorious Baal spawn chose to release the essence rather than claiming it for themselves, allowing Baal's return, but preserving their own mortality and identity. Others whisper of different outcomes, paths where the Baal spawn embraced divinity and ascended to become the new god of murder. What remains certain is that Baal eventually reclaimed his domain, tearing the portfolio from Siric's grasp and resuming his place among the gods of Faerun. The Lord of Murder returned, though the precise mechanism of that return varies depending on which temple's records you consult and which survivor's tale you believe. Yet Baal's return did not end the story of his children entirely. Some Baal spawn may have survived the crisis, their essence too dispersed or too hidden to be gathered in that final consolidation. If such survivors exist, they walk the world still, carrying fragments of the murder god within them, living with the knowledge that they are relics of a completed resurrection, pieces left over from a divine puzzle that has already been solved. They would no longer hunt each other with the same desperate intensity, for Baal has returned, and their purpose as vessels has ended. But the essence would remain, and with it the powers, the urges, the curse of being children of murder in a world where their father once again walks among the gods. The whispering eye sees them still, these remnants of a desperate plan, these living monuments to a god's fear of death. It watches them struggle with what they are, with the blood that will not let them forget their origin. Some may have found peace. Others have found only endless conflict, internal or external, battling against a nature that cannot be fully escaped. All of them carry the same question unspoken, but ever present in their hearts. What does it mean to be born for a purpose that has already been fulfilled? What identity remains when the role you were created to play has ended? These are the whispers that follow the ball spawn through their days and haunt their nights. Questions without answers, curses without cures. Section 2. Servak Anshev, the dark prodigy's hunger for godhood. Among the hundreds of children bearing Baal's blood, one stood apart not for the strength of his essence alone, but for the clarity of his ambition. Servak Anshev understood what he was from the moment awareness first touched his consciousness. And that understanding became the foundation of a hunger that would consume kingdoms if it meant ascending to divinity. Born in the year of the banner, 1348 Dale Reckoning, Servak entered the world already steeped in violence, his mother a prostitute in the city of Baldur's Gate, his father a fragment of a murdered god. But unlike so many of his siblings, who stumbled through life confused by urges they could not name, Servak knew his purpose from childhood, knew that godhood waited for the ballspawn strong enough and ruthless enough to seize it. You need to understand the mind of a demigod who believes divinity is his birthright. Servak did not merely accept his heritage. He embraced it with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. Where other ballspawns struggled with their violent impulses, tried to suppress the whispers of murder that echoed in their thoughts, Servak listened intently and obeyed. He studied the nature of his essence, experimented with the powers flowing through his veins, learned to call upon the Slayer transformation, and wield it as weapon rather than curse. Every lesson in his youth centered on one singular goal: accumulating enough divine essence to transcend mortality entirely, to become what his father once was, to claim the throne of murder as his own domain. The Iron Throne Merchant Consortium that adopted him in his youth saw potential in the boy's ruthlessness and intelligence. But they could not comprehend the true scope of his ambition. They thought they were grooming a capable assassin and merchant lord. They were actually nurturing a would-be god. The city of Baldur's Gate became Servak's testing ground, the stage upon which he would orchestrate a crisis designed to consolidate power and create the chaos necessary for his ascension. He needed war, not small conflicts between petty lords, but a conflagration that would engulf the Sword Coast, that would generate enough death and violence to empower him through Baal's residual influence over murder. The Iron Crisis began as sabotage in the mines north of the city. Contaminated iron ore producing brittle weapons and tools that shattered without warning. Merchants blamed each other. Guilds accused rivals of conspiracy. And tensions between Baldur's Gate and the neighboring nation of Am escalated toward open warfare. Behind every thread of this unraveling piece stood Servok, manipulating trade routes, assassinating key figures who might broker reconciliation, ensuring that the path to war remained not just open, but inevitable. But the Iron Crisis served a purpose beyond simple warmongering. Servok understood that to truly ascend, he needed more than ambient power from murder and chaos. He needed the essence carried by his siblings, the fragments of Baal scattered across hundreds of Baalspawn throughout Faerun. This could imply he developed methods to sense other Baalspawn when they drew near. The divine essence, perhaps recognizing itself across bloodlines. Some he killed personally, reveling in the surge of power that accompanied their deaths. Others he arranged to have eliminated through proxies. His network of cultists and hired blades, ensuring that no Baalspawn who entered his domain left it alive. The Flaming Fist, Baldur's Gate's mercenary army and primary law enforcement, should have been an obstacle to Servok's plans. Instead, he infiltrated their leadership, using a combination of political maneuvering, assassination, and carefully cultivated alliances to position himself as a respected figure within their ranks. When Grand Duke Entar Silvershield's health began to fail, poisoned by agents working for Servok, the path opened for the Baalspawn to marry Silvershield's daughter and claim a position of legitimate authority within the city's government. He wore the mask of civilization with practiced ease, playing the role of concerned merchant lord and dutiful son-in-law, while his true work proceeded in shadows and blood. The nobles of Baldur's Gate saw him as ambitious, but ultimately manageable. A young man of questionable background, but undeniable talent. They did not see the monster beneath the polish, the creature who viewed them as nothing more than obstacles or tools in his quest for godhood. Servok's temple to Baal, hidden beneath the city in chambers carved from ancient stone, became the nexus of his power. There he conducted rituals designed to channel the essence he had accumulated, to prepare himself for the transformation that would elevate him beyond mortality. The architecture itself seemed to resonate with dark purpose, altars stained with sacrificial blood, symbols of murder and death carved into every surface, the air thick with the presence of something that was not quite divine, but no longer entirely mortal. His followers worshipped him as much as they worshipped Baal, recognizing that the line between their master and their god grew thinner with each passing day, with each Baal-spawn death. They believed they served the next god of murder, and in their belief, they gave Servok strength, their faith feeding the essence within him just as the killings did. The confrontation that ended Servok's first bid for godhood came not from the authorities of Baldur's Gate, not from the flaming fist or the city's dukes, but from another Baalspawn, a sibling who had been raised in the fortress library of Candlekeep, sheltered from knowledge of their heritage until circumstances forced revelation, hunted Servok through the layers of conspiracy and murder he had built around himself. This sibling, empowered by their own accumulated essence and driven by a combination of revenge and justice, penetrated Servok's defenses and reached the temple beneath the city. The battle that followed transcended mortal combat, two demigods unleashing powers that cracked stone and burned the very air. The Slayer transformations manifesting as they struck at each other with strength born of divine lineage. Servok fought with the confidence of one who believed victory was destiny, who had prepared for this moment his entire life. But confidence is not the same as certainty, and preparation does not guarantee success. When Servok fell, when his sibling's blade finally pierced his heart and the life drained from his body, the essence he had so carefully gathered did not elevate him to godhood. It dispersed, flowing to the victor, as Baal's plan had always intended, leaving Servok's corpse cooling on the temple floor, while his consciousness plummeted into darkness. Death came for him as it comes for all mortals, but death for a Baalspawn, especially one who had accumulated as much essence as Servok, does not follow ordinary rules. His soul descended not to the fugue plane where most mortals await judgment, but somewhere far darker, drawn by the weight of murders he had committed, and the taint of divine essence still clinging to his spirit even after death. The afterlife does not grant rest to those who die steeped in violence and dark ambition. Based on what we know of how Baalspawn souls were treated after death, Servok's consciousness endured in whatever realm claimed him, held together by the same iron will that had driven his ambitions in life. He did not repent. He did not seek redemption. He endured. Even stripped of physical form and power, Servok's will remained intact, his hunger for godhood undiminished by the failure that had killed him. Time in the lower planes flows strangely, but through it all his consciousness remained focused on one goal: finding a path back to the living world, reclaiming what he had lost, resuming his quest for divinity. His resurrection came through the intervention of his sibling, the same Baalspawn who had killed him. Circumstances and necessity drove them to seek Servoc's knowledge and power, to restore him to life, despite the danger such an act represented. The ritual that pulled his soul from wherever it had descended and bound it once more to flesh was dark magic of the highest order, requiring components and sacrifices that would horrify most mortals. But it succeeded, and Servoc drew breath again, standing once more in the world he had sought to dominate. Yet resurrection changes a being, especially when that being has spent time separated from mortal flesh. Servoc returned different, not softened by his experience, but refined, his ambition tempered by understanding that the path to godhood required more than strength and ruthlessness alone. He had been killed by another ballspawn, defeated at the moment of his greatest power, and that defeat taught him lessons, even as it failed to extinguish his hunger. The ballspawn who resurrected Servoc did not restore him out of mercy or family feeling. They needed his knowledge of Baal's essence, his understanding of the divine fragments, and how they could be manipulated or controlled. Servoc became both ally and asset, walking a complex path between cooperation and rivalry, forced to watch as his sibling accumulated the very power he had sought for himself. The irony did not escape him. He had hunted his siblings to gather essence, had orchestrated a crisis that killed thousands in pursuit of godhood, and now he aided another in achieving what he could not. Yet even in this position he learned, studied the patterns of essence consolidation, observed how his sibling handled the increasing pressure of accumulated divinity. He understood that his first attempt had been premature, that timing mattered as much as power, that the game of godhood played across longer time frames than mortal ambition typically acknowledged. When the final confrontation of the ballspawn crisis occurred, when Emilisin, the Black-Hearted, revealed her true plan and sought to claim all of Baal's essence for herself, Servoc fought alongside his sibling against her, not from love or redemption, but from pragmatic recognition that if Emilisin succeeded, no ballspawn would ever achieve ascension, that she would become a goddess of murder, leaving no room for others to rise. He lent his strength to the battle, used every fragment of knowledge he had gathered about divine essence and the nature of Baal's resurrection plan. And when the essence finally reconsolidated, when all the fragments of Baal's divinity united, Servoc watched as events unfolded that would lead to the Murder Lord's eventual return. The Lord of Murder's resurrection meant different things for different ballspawn. For most, it meant release, the end of the hunt, and the terrible pressure to kill their siblings. For Servoc, it meant failure on a cosmic scale. He had dedicated his entire existence to becoming a god, had murdered and manipulated and orchestrated crises in pursuit of divinity. And in the end, Baal reclaimed his throne, his portfolio, his domain over murder and death, while Servak remained merely mortal, a failed aspirant with nothing to show for his ambitions, but scars and bitter knowledge. Yet he did not despair, did not collapse into nihilistic acceptance of defeat. The hunger remained. It always remains in those who have tasted the possibility of transcendence and found themselves denied. In the years following Baal's return, Servak carved out existence in a world that had moved beyond the Baalspawn crisis. He could no longer gather essence from his siblings in the way Baal had originally designed, could no longer pursue that particular path to godhood. But power comes in many forms, and influence can be accumulated through means other than divine essence. He became something between advisor and enforcer, offering his knowledge to those who could afford it, his understanding of murder and violence, and the nature of divine power making him valuable to organizations that operated in darkness. His combat prowess remained formidable. The Slayer transformation still lived within him, Baal's gift unclaimed even after the gods' return. Others wanted his strategic mind, his ability to orchestrate complex schemes across years or decades. Servak provided both, serving interests that aligned with his own continued empowerment, even if they no longer led directly to godhood. But perhaps the most complex twist in Servak's story manifests in his bloodline's continuation. Helena Anshev, daughter born to Servak, inherited a portion of his Baalspawn essence through blood, if not through direct divine parentage. She bore a daughter named Orin through a union twisted by cult practice and manipulation. And though the divine blood thinned with each generation, enough remained to mark the child as special, as touched by the murder god's legacy. Orin the Red grew into a creature of violence and instability, shaped by a childhood of abuse and indoctrination into Baal's cult, her great-grandfather's essence diluted, but still potent in her veins. She became one of Baal's chosen, serving the returned god with absolute devotion. Her shape-shifting abilities and talent for murder earning her position as one of his most valued servants. Servak's relationship with Orin carries layers of tragedy and irony that would be almost darkly poetic if they were not so deeply painful. He sought godhood and failed, spent his life accumulating power and essence, only to see it slip through his fingers at the moment of transformation. His great-granddaughter achieved recognition and favor from Baal himself, not ascending to full divinity, but becoming a chosen servant of the god Servak had tried to replace. She carries his blood, his legacy, his connection to the murder god, and uses it in service rather than usurpation. What Servak feels when he considers Orin remains known, perhaps only to him, but one can infer tension in that relationship. Unspoken questions about inherited ambition and the price of serving rather than becoming. The hunger in Servak never truly dies, You can sense it in accounts of those who have dealt with him, in the way he moves through the world with purpose that seems to extend beyond immediate concerns. He learned from his first failure, understood that direct confrontation and accumulation of essence alone cannot breach the barrier between demigod and deity. But learning from failure does not mean abandoning the goal, merely adjusting the approach. Servak remains patient in a way few mortals achieve, because he carries enough of Baal's essence to extend his lifespan beyond normal human boundaries, because he understands that true power requires waiting for the correct moment rather than forcing premature action. The Baal-spawn crisis ended his first attempt, but based on his continued existence and involvement in dark schemes, it seems unlikely he believes it ended his only attempt. The world continues to turn. Gods rise and fall with some regularity in Faerun's turbulent history, and Servak watches it all with the eyes of one who came within grasp of divinity and still believes he can reach it again. This could imply he studies the patterns of divine ascension, observes the mechanisms by which mortals have achieved godhood through means other than accumulated essence, notes the weaknesses in divine conflicts and the ways they might be exploited. Somewhere in his mind, plans likely form and reform, strategies potentially centuries in the making that might yet bear fruit in a world where divinity itself proves more mutable than most mortals realize. Whether he will ever achieve his goal, whether any path remains for a failed Baal-spawn to transcend mortality after his father's return, remains a question only time can answer. But the whispering eye knows what drives him, sees the core truth beneath all his planning and patience. Servak Anshev cannot let go, cannot accept that some ambitions, no matter how fervently pursued, remain forever beyond reach, cannot release the dream of godhood that has defined him since childhood, that shaped every choice, that justifies every murder and betrayal in the ledger of his existence. He is a monument to divine hunger unsatisfied, a cautionary tale about the price of ambition that exceeds even demigod capacity. And he remains dangerous precisely because he has learned patience, because failure refined rather than destroyed him, because the hunger persists with undiminished intensity beneath the surface of careful calculation. In the end, Servak represents something fundamental about the nature of demigods and their tragic relationship with full divinity. They stand close enough to godhood to taste it, to feel its possibility burning in their blood, but remain forever separated by a gulf that mere power cannot bridge. That proximity breeds obsession, transforms ambition into desperate need, creates beings who can never be satisfied with what they are because they have glimpsed what they might become. Servak embodies that tragedy completely, eternally reaching for transcendence that recedes with each grasping attempt. unable to stop reaching, because stopping would mean admitting that his entire existence has been in service of an impossible dream. Section 3. Mystra, the thrice-murdered goddess of magic. Magic flows through the world like blood through veins, invisible to most yet essential to existence. And at the heart of that flow sits a goddess who has died more times than any deity should endure. Mystra, the Lady of Mysteries, keeper of the weave, guardian of magic itself, carries a burden unique among the pantheon of Faerun. She does not simply risk death, as other gods do when they engage in divine conflicts or mortal schemes. She attracts death, draws it to herself with a regularity that suggests something fundamental about the nature of magic, makes its keeper perpetually vulnerable. 3 times she has fallen. 3 times the weave has shuddered, and reality itself has trembled at the edge of unraveling. And 3 times, magic has found a way to restore itself through new vessels, new incarnations of the divine force that makes wizardry possible. You need to understand that Mystra was not always Mystra, that the goddess who holds magic now inherited a title and responsibility that predates her existence by millennia. In the beginning, when the world was younger and humanity had barely begun to comprehend the power flowing through creation, the first goddess of magic bore the name Mistral. She embodied raw magical force, the pure essence of the weave before mortals truly understood how to manipulate it for their purposes. Mistral was ancient beyond reckoning, one of the oldest powers in the pantheon, and she maintained the delicate balance that allowed magic to exist without consuming reality. The weave she tended was not simply a source of power for spellcasters. It was the fundamental structure that held natural law together, that prevented the raw chaos of magical energy from dissolving the boundaries between planes, between matter and void, between existence and annihilation. The first death came through mortal arrogance reaching heights that even gods had not anticipated. Karsus, an archmage of the ancient empire of Netheril, achieved magical prowess that surpassed perhaps any human before or since. He created a spell, the only 12th level magic ever successfully cast, designed to steal the power of a deity and claim it for himself. He chose Mistral as his target, believing that by taking her divine essence, he could achieve immortality and power beyond mortal comprehension. The spell succeeded. For one terrible moment, Karsus became a god, channeling all of Mistral's divine power through his mortal form, experiencing omniscience and omnipotence that no human mind was designed to contain. But in that same moment, the weave collapsed, without Mistral's consciousness maintaining it, without her divine awareness balancing the flow of magic across all of reality. The structure began to fail catastrophically. Karsus understood his mistake in the seconds before it killed him. He felt the weave unraveling, felt magic dying across the world, felt the floating cities of Nethril beginning to fall as the enchantments sustaining them failed. He tried to restore what he had broken, but mortal minds cannot comprehend divine responsibility quickly enough to prevent catastrophe. The cities fell, thousands died, and Mistral, in her final act before dissolution, altered the nature of magic itself to prevent such theft from ever occurring again. She sacrificed her existence to save the weave, fragmenting her consciousness and reforming as a new entity, a new goddess bearing a new name. Mystra rose from Mistral's death, inheriting the responsibility and power, but changed fundamentally by the experience of destruction and resurrection. She established new rules for magic, limiting the levels of spells mortals could access, ensuring that no wizard would ever again reach the heights Karsus had achieved. The second death came during the time of troubles, that catastrophic period when Io, the overgod who maintains balance among all deities, cast the gods from their divine realms and forced them to walk Toril as mortals. The reason for this divine punishment varied depending on which god you asked, but the result remained devastatingly clear. Gods manifested in physical form, vulnerable to mortal weapons and mortal death. Their divine power greatly diminished as they struggled to survive in a world suddenly hostile to their presence. Mystra attempted to return to the heavens, to bypass Io's punishment and reclaim her place as guardian of the weave. She gathered her power and prepared to ascend, believing perhaps that her unique role as keeper of magic made her exempt from the rules binding other deities. Helm, the god of guardians, stood watch at the gates to the divine realms, with orders from Io to allow no deity passage until the time of troubles concluded. When Mystra approached and demanded entry, Helm refused. She pleaded, then commanded, then threatened, explaining that her absence from the heavens endangered the weave itself, that magic could not survive without her direct oversight. Helm remained unmoved. His duty was absolute, his orders clear, and he would not violate them even for the goddess of magic, even knowing the consequences. When Mystra tried to force her way past him, Helm struck her down. The blow killed her mortal form instantly, and without her divine essence anchored to the heavens, she died truly and completely. The weave shuddered, but did not collapse, held together by the framework Mystra had established. But the goddess herself ceased to exist. The mantle of magic did not remain empty for long. Io selected a new vessel, a mortal woman who had become entangled in the divine conflicts of the time of troubles, and proven herself worthy of ascension. Midnight, a young mage who had witnessed the chaos gods wrought upon the world, who had fought alongside and against deities walking in mortal flesh, received the burden and power of magic's guardianship. She ascended to become the new Mystra, inheriting not just power, but the memories and responsibilities of her predecessor. This was not simply a promotion or elevation to divinity. Based on accounts of divine ascension, Midnight's mortal identity essentially ceased to exist in its original form, subsumed into the greater consciousness of Mystra, continuing the goddess of magic's existence through a new vessel. She became Mystra, not in name only but in essence, her mortal life fading to a distant memory as divine purpose overwhelmed personal history. The third death, the most recent and perhaps most devastating, came through betrayal orchestrated by two deities working in concert to destroy her. Sirik, the mad god who had ascended to power during the time of troubles, by claiming the portfolios of multiple dead deities, grew paranoid and unstable in his divinity. His madness deepened with each passing year, until he could barely distinguish between ally and enemy, between reality and the delusions his fractured consciousness produced. Shar, the ancient goddess of darkness and loss, recognized opportunity in Sirik's madness. She whispered to him, encouraged his paranoid fantasies, convinced him that Mystra plotted against him and needed to be eliminated before she could act. Shar had her own reasons for wanting the goddess of magic dead, ancient grudges that stretched back to Mystra's creation from the torn divine essence of Shar and her sister Selune in ages past. Sirik attacked Mystra in her divine realm of Tuomarheart, the place where the goddess maintained closest connection to the weave itself. The assault was brutal, divine powers clashing with intensity that rippled across planes. Mystra fought desperately, but Sirik's madness made him unpredictable, and Shar's assistance, given secretly and carefully to avoid detection, tipped the balance. When Sirik's final blow struck home, when Mystra's divine form shattered under the mad god's assault, Tuomarheart detonated. The goddess of magic did not die quietly or cleanly. Her death throes tore apart her divine realm and sent shockwaves through the weave that manifested in the mortal world as catastrophe beyond imagination. The spell plague began in that moment of divine death, spreading across Faerun and beyond like a plague of pure magical chaos. The weave, deprived of its keeper's guiding consciousness for the third time in history, twisted and warped in ways that defied natural law. Regions of wild magic emerged where spells functioned unpredictably or not at all. Entire landscapes transformed overnight as uncontrolled magical energy reshaped reality according to no pattern mortals could discern. Wizards found their carefully learned spells failing, producing effects wildly different from intended results, sometimes killing the caster in backlash of uncontrolled power. The dead rose spontaneously in some areas as necromantic energy flooded the world. In other places, gravity ceased functioning normally, or time flowed at different rates, or the barriers between planes grew thin enough that creatures from other realities crossed into Toral with ease. The spell plague killed millions, not directly through Mystra's death, but through the cascade of magical disasters her absence triggered. Cities protected by ancient wards found those defenses suddenly failing, leaving them vulnerable to attacks they had not needed mundane walls to repel. Magical transportation systems collapsed, stranding travelers in hostile environments or between dimensions. Artificers and enchanters discovered their creations malfunctioning catastrophically, animated objects turning on their creators, flying ships plummeting from the sky. The devastation stretched across years as reality slowly stabilized, the weave knitting itself back together through processes even archmages struggled to comprehend. Some regions never fully recovered, remaining as wild magic zones where the fundamental laws governing spellcasting differ from the rest of the world. But magic itself proved more resilient than perhaps even gods understood. The weave survived without its keeper, diminished and damaged, but not destroyed. Over time, a new Mystra emerged, reconstituted from the fragments of divine essence and the fundamental necessity that magic requires a guiding consciousness. This newest incarnation carried memories and knowledge from all previous versions, a palimpsest of divine experience, stretching back through Midnight's ascension to the original Mistral's ancient wisdom. She resumed her place as guardian of magic, restoring stability to the weave and bringing the worst excesses of the spell plague under control. Yet the scars remained, in the world and in the goddess herself, reminders that divine death carries consequences mortal minds can barely fathom. The pattern emerges when you consider all three deaths together, when you step back and observe what they reveal about divinity and vulnerability, and the nature of power itself. Mystra dies when magic becomes too concentrated, too powerful, or when cosmic forces determine her existence threatens some greater balance. Karsus reached heights of magical mastery that endangered reality, and Mistral died, stopping him. Mystra violated Io's direct command during the time of troubles, and Helm killed her for it. The second Mystra grew powerful enough that even Cyric's madness recognized her as a threat, and Shar's ancient hatred provided the means for her destruction. Each death serves as a reset, a way for the cosmic order to limit magic's power by destroying and reconstituting its keeper. The goddess of magic cannot protect herself from these recurring assassinations, because protecting herself would require accumulating the very power that makes her a target. You can feel the injustice in this pattern, the cruelty of a cosmic design that condemns one deity to repeated death, while others maintain their existence across millennia without such violent interruptions. Mistra serves a fundamental role in reality's function, maintains a power essential to civilization and nature alike. Yet, that very service marks her for destruction with terrible regularity. She cannot refuse her duty. Without a guardian, the weave collapses and magic ceases to function or functions so chaotically that reality itself risks dissolution. But accepting the duty means accepting that death will come, that other gods or mortals or cosmic forces will eventually decide she has grown too powerful or too inconvenient, or simply too present in affairs they wish to control. The betrayal runs deeper than simple divine conflict or competition for portfolios and worshippers. Other gods benefit from Mistra's existence, rely on magic for their own purposes, use the weave she maintains to manifest their powers in the mortal world. Yet they offer little protection when assassins come. They provide no aid when Cyric attacks, no intervention when Helm raises his blade, no warning when Karsus prepares his ultimate spell. Perhaps they cannot interfere without violating cosmic laws that bind deities more surely than chains bind mortals. Or perhaps they simply recognize that Mistra's death, while temporarily inconvenient, will not prove permanent. That magic requires a keeper and will generate a new one regardless of how many times the current guardian falls. The goddess of magic exists in a state of perpetual vulnerability, knowing that her position attracts violence, that her power makes her a target, that her essential nature prevents her from defending herself as other gods might. The relationship between Mistra and her mortal followers carries weight beyond typical divine worship. Wizards who draw upon the weave for their spells literally depend on her continued existence for their abilities. When she dies, their power falters. Their carefully learned magic becomes unreliable or impossible. They pray to her not just from devotion, but from practical necessity, recognizing that their entire life's work rests on the foundation she maintains. This creates an intimacy between goddess and worshipper, rarely seen in other divine relationships. Mistra knows each wizard who touches the weave, feels them drawing upon magic, monitors their use of power to ensure they do not threaten the balance she guards. Wizards, in turn, sense her presence in their spellcasting, the subtle guidance that helps them shape raw magical energy into desired effects. When Mistra dies, wizards mourn not abstractly, but personally, feeling the loss as they would feel the death of a mentor or beloved teacher. The spell plague traumatized generations of spellcasters who lived through it, who experienced the terror of reaching for familiar magic and finding chaos instead, who watched their spells twist into nightmares and their life's research become obsolete overnight. Some never recovered, abandoning arcane studies entirely or descending into madness, trying to comprehend what had gone wrong. Others adapted, learning to work with the changed weave, but they carried scars from the experience, a wariness born of understanding that their power rests on a foundation that can be shattered through forces beyond their control or comprehension. The whispering eye observes Mistra with something approaching sorrow, that most human of emotions, somehow fitting for a goddess who has died and returned more times than any deity should have to endure. She represents the ultimate divine tragedy, a being of immense power rendered perpetually vulnerable by that same power, unable to protect herself without becoming the very threat that necessitates her destruction. She serves faithfully, maintains the weave with careful attention, grants magic to mortals and gods alike without demanding the absolute devotion other deities require. Yet service brings no security, faithfulness earns no protection, and her generosity becomes the very quality that allows others to take her for granted, to assume she will always be present because magic must always function. In the quiet moments between crises, when the weave flows smoothly and spells function as designed, one can infer that Mistra must carry the weight of knowledge that another death approaches eventually. She does not know when or how, cannot predict which threat will prove lethal or which ally will turn betrayer. But the pattern established across 3 deaths suggests a 4th waits somewhere in the future. Perhaps she has grown resigned to this cycle, accepting death as part of her divine purpose, the way mortals accept aging. Or perhaps each resurrection brings renewed hope that this time will be different, that this incarnation will finally achieve the stability her predecessors could not maintain. The eye cannot see into a goddess's heart with certainty, but it watches her tend the weave with dedication that seems tinged with melancholy. The weight of one who knows her service will likely end in violence, and the best she can hope for is that reality survives her next death long enough for magic to reconstitute her once more. Section 4. Shar and Selune, the eternal sisterhood of betrayal. Before the gods walked the earth, before mortals drew breath or dragons claimed the skies, 2 beings emerged from the primordial void that preceded existence. They were not born in the way mortals understand birth, not created by some higher power in a moment of divine will. They simply coalesced from the primordial essence of the universe itself. 2 consciousnesses awakening to awareness in the empty dark before creation. Shar and Selune, darkness and light, loss and hope. The Night Singer and the Moon Maiden, twin sisters, who were so close they thought of themselves as one being. Known in ancient times as the 2-faced goddess, or the sisters who were one. Yet they were distinct from the first moment, silver-haired and raven-haired, representing opposite forces that would eventually tear them apart in conflict so ancient and absolute that reality itself bears the scars of their hatred. you need to understand that their unity preceded division, that in those first moments of consciousness, the twin goddesses complemented each other perfectly. Shar embodied the primordial darkness, the void, the stillness and silence that held infinite potential precisely because it contained nothing. She was entropy and ending, the peace of oblivion, the comfort of non-existence, where pain and loss cannot touch you because you simply are not. Selune represented the opposite impulse, the radiant light, the drive toward warmth and illumination, the belief that existence itself held value worth fighting for. They were beautiful and terrible in their opposition, yet so intertwined in those early ages that they functioned as a single divine consciousness with two faces, creating order from the chaos that preceded them. The creation of the universe began as their shared work, the only time in their existence when Shar and Selune collaborated without division or conflict. Together, they created the heavenly bodies of the crystal sphere, pulling matter from formless void and shaping it into planets and moons and asteroids that would form the physical universe. This cosmos they birthed together was darkened by the welcoming embrace of Shar and illuminated by the cool, radiant light of Selune. A balance between their opposing natures that created something neither could have achieved alone. Into these worlds, they infused a divine spirit, creating Chantia, the Earth Mother, whose essence embodied all the planets and spheres they had formed, giving the physical universe a consciousness of its own. But Chantia desired more than mere existence. She wanted to nurture life, to see creatures grow and thrive upon the worlds that were her body and limbs. She begged the twin goddesses for warmth, for heat that would allow living things to flourish on the cold planets spinning through the darkness. And for the first time, the sisters who were one found themselves divided in purpose, of two minds where once there had been unity. Selune looked upon Chantia's plea and felt compassion, recognized the beauty that life could bring to their creation, wanted to give the Earth Mother what she asked. Shar refused. She saw life as corruption of the perfection they had achieved, the introduction of chaos and suffering into a universe that was beautiful precisely because it remained empty and still. Living things would inevitably experience pain, loss, death, all the sorrows that Shar recognized as fundamental to existence. Better to leave creation pristine and unpopulated than to curse countless beings with cycles of suffering that ended in oblivion anyway. The argument between them escalated beyond words, beyond the unity that had defined their relationship since consciousness first awakened in the void. Selune could not bear to deny Chantia's request, could not look upon the barren worlds and refuse to fill them with life. Shar could not understand how her sister could be so cruel as to create beings designed to suffer and die. Neither would yield and the stalemate threatened to tear apart everything they had built together. Eventually, Selûne acted alone, reaching across time and space to a land of eternal fire, to the plane of fire itself. Fighting through the agony of that ever-living flame, which burned her sorely and wounded her divine form. She broke off a fragment of that eternal blaze and brought it back to the crystal sphere. She ignited the largest of the heavenly bodies so that it burned in the sky, creating a sun that warmed Chauntea and allowed life to begin flourishing on the worlds below. Shar's fury at this betrayal knew no bounds. Her sister had violated their unity, had acted without agreement, had brought warmth and life to a universe that should have remained dark and empty. Incensed beyond reason, Shar redoubled her assault, seeking to snuff out all light and heat throughout the crystal sphere, to return creation to the void from which it came. The battle between the twin goddesses raged across eons, divine powers clashing with such intensity that residual energies from their combat coalesced into new deities born of violence and conflict. Gods of war, disease, murder, and death emerged from the residues of that terrible battle. Lesser powers created accidentally from the overflow of primordial fury. Selûne fought desperately, but Shar's power proved overwhelming. The dark goddess began systematically extinguishing every mode of light her sister had created, advancing toward total victory, toward the obliteration of warmth and the restoration of eternal darkness. Wounded from reaching into the plane of fire, diminished by the long conflict, Selûne faced defeat and the destruction of everything she had fought to preserve. In that moment of desperation, she made a choice that would change the nature of reality itself. She tore the divine essence of magic from her own body, ripping it free in an act of self-mutilation that would leave her permanently weakened, and flung it at her sister in defense of life and light. The magical essence struck Shar with devastating force, ripping through her divine form and tearing an equal portion of energy from the dark goddess as it passed. The combined essences, light and dark magic blended together, reformed behind Shar as a new deity entirely. Mistral, the first goddess of magic, came into being from the torn fragments of both sisters, embodying powers drawn equally from darkness and light, from loss and hope, from entropy and creation. She was their daughter in a sense, born not from love, but from violence, created from the most intimate parts of themselves torn free, and merged through desperate necessity. Both Shar and Selûne were diminished by Mistral's creation, their divine essence reduced, their power permanently lessened by what they had lost. Mistral did not remain neutral between her mothers. Though composed of both light and dark magic in equal measure, she favored Selûne from the beginning, aligning herself with the silver goddess who had created her in defense of life. This tipped the balance of power, allowing Selune to achieve an uneasy truce with her more naturally powerful dark twin. Shar retreated, consumed by bitterness at her defeat, vowing eternal revenge against the sister who had betrayed their unity and the daughter who had chosen wrong. The war between them did not end, merely paused, shifting from open conflict to millennia of subtle manipulation and proxy battles fought through their followers and allied deities. The creation of Mistral had another consequence beyond ending the immediate battle. The new goddess established the weave, the fundamental structure that allows mortal creatures to access and manipulate magical energy. Magic ceased being solely the domain of deities and became something mortals with talent or training could learn to wield. This democratization of power infuriated Shar even further, seeing it as another corruption of the perfect void she had envisioned. In response, she created the Shadow Weave, a dark mirror to Mistral's creation, ensuring that, for every act of creation magic enabled, there existed capacity for destruction and entropy. The Shadow Weave became Shar's tool for undermining her sister's work, a source of power drawn from darkness and loss that would oppose the light-aligned weave across all of history. The enmity between the sisters deepened rather than diminished across the ages following their breaking. Shar gathered followers among those who embraced loss and darkness, who found comfort in her promise that all pain eventually ends in oblivion, that secrets kept and emotions suppressed offer protection from suffering. She built a church of shadows and silence, taught her faithful to reject the false hope that Selune offered, to recognize that light only makes the darkness that follows more painful. Her clergy worked in secrecy, undermining their rivals, hoarding knowledge, and destroying it to keep others ignorant, embracing the Night Singer's philosophy that what you never have cannot be taken from you. They became masters of manipulation and controlled information, understanding that darkness grows more powerful when light believes itself triumphant. Selune drew different worshippers, those who refused to surrender to despair, who believed that struggle against darkness held meaning even knowing darkness would eventually claim everything. Sailors prayed to her for guidance through night voyages, using moon and stars to navigate treacherous waters. Women sought her blessing for protection and empowerment, finding in the Moon Maiden a goddess who understood the particular struggles they faced. Her clergy taught that light must be actively maintained against darkness's encroachment. That hope required constant renewal, that every moment of beauty or joy justified existence despite inevitable ending. They opposed Shar's faithful wherever they encountered them, viewing the dark goddess's philosophy as poison that denied life's fundamental value. The war between their churches became proxy for the war the goddesses themselves could not finish. Priests of Shar assassinated followers of Selune under cover of night, stole holy relics and destroyed them, infiltrated temples to sow discord and doubt among the faithful. Clerics of Selûne hunted Shar's servants with righteous fury, purged her influence from communities that had fallen under Shadow's sway, worked to expose the secrets and lies that gave darkness its power. Mortals died in their thousands over millennia of conflict, each side believing they served cosmic necessity, that their goddess's triumph would somehow resolve the fundamental tension between light and dark, hope and despair, creation and entropy. But neither goddess can truly triumph because they define each other through opposition. Shar cannot destroy Selûne without erasing the light that gives darkness meaning, the hope that makes loss comprehensible. Selûne cannot eliminate Shar without losing the contrast that makes light visible, the shadow that defines illumination, the loss that gives preservation value. They are twin aspects forged from the same primordial essence, forever divided, yet forever bound, eternally opposed, yet dependent on each other's continued existence for their own identity. This paradox drives them both toward increasingly desperate schemes and manipulations, each seeking advantage that will never translate into final victory. Shar's hatred runs deeper, burns colder, endures longer than perhaps any emotion in the cosmos. She cannot forgive Selûne for choosing creation over void, for populating the sterile perfection they built together with life destined to suffer. Every mortal born represents another of her sister's victories, another consciousness that will experience pain and loss before inevitable ending. Every act of creation mocks the peace Shar believes oblivion offers. She works tirelessly to increase suffering in the world, not from sadism, but from conviction that showing mortals the futility of hope will turn them toward her philosophy, will make them understand that her sister's light offers only false comfort before darkness claims everything anyway. Her greatest success in recent ages came through manipulating Sirik into killing Mistra, the goddess born from torn fragments of both sisters. Shar recognized opportunity in the mad god's paranoia, whispered carefully crafted lies that convinced him Mistra plotted his destruction, provided subtle assistance that helped him breach Dweomer Heart's defenses. When Mistra died and the spell plague erupted across Faerûn, Shar felt satisfaction that transcended simple victory over an enemy. She had struck at her sister through their mutual daughter, demonstrated that creation's gifts could be revoked, that the magic Selûne had helped birth through Mistral's creation could be twisted into source of suffering rather than wonder. The millions who died in the spell plague's chaos, the civilizations that fell, the suffering that spread across decades, all of it proved Shar's point that existence itself was curse rather than blessing. Selûne grieved for Mistra as mother grieves for murdered daughter. But her sorrow did not drive her toward reconciliation or surrender. Instead, it hardened her resolve, confirmed her belief that Shar's philosophy led only to cruelty and destruction that served no purpose beyond inflicting pain. The Moon Maiden worked through her faithful to mitigate the spell plague's worst effects, guided survivors toward safety, helped communities rebuild in the aftermath of magical catastrophe. She could not undo what Shar had orchestrated, could not resurrect all the dead, or restore what the chaos had destroyed. But she could demonstrate that hope survived even in the face of overwhelming loss, that mortals possessed strength to rebuild and continue despite grief that might otherwise break them. The cycle continues without end or resolution. Shar schemes and manipulates, working through mortal agents and divine allies to increase darkness and loss in the world. Selune opposes her where possible, offers hope and light to counter her sister's shadow, works to preserve creation against entropy's patient hunger. Neither makes meaningful progress toward ultimate victory, because ultimate victory remains impossible. They are locked together in opposition, as fundamental and eternal as the rotation of worlds, the cycle of day and night, the dance between presence and absence that defines existence itself. Mortals caught between them suffer the consequences of divine hatred that predates their species, that will outlast their civilizations, that uses them as pawns in a game neither goddess can win. The tragedy here runs deeper than simple divine conflict or sibling rivalry writ cosmic. Shar and Selune were once so close they thought of themselves as a single being, the two-faced goddess who created the universe through shared purpose. They collaborated on the most fundamental act of divine power imaginable, shaping reality from primordial void, building the cosmos together before division tore them apart. The breaking between them represents loss on scale mortals cannot fully comprehend, the shattering of primordial unity into eternal opposition. They are each other's greatest enemy and only true peer, the single being in all existence who understands what the other is, because they began from the same essence. That understanding makes their hatred more painful, their conflict more bitter, their inability to reconcile more tragic. The whispering eye watches them circle each other across ages, observes the elaborate schemes and counter-schemes, the mortal lives spent in service of their eternal war. It sees what they perhaps cannot acknowledge, that their continued opposition serves as its own kind of connection, that fighting each other keeps them engaged with the only being who truly understands their nature. Reconciliation would require one or both to fundamentally change their nature, to abandon principles that define their very existence. And such change might be equivalent to death for beings as ancient and set in their ways as primordial goddesses. So they continue the dance, light and shadow eternally opposed, hope and loss locked in struggle without resolution. Twin sisters separated by the very choice to create life in the universe they built together. In the quiet moments between crises, when Char's plots have not yet matured, and Selune's faithful work to rebuild from the last catastrophe, one might wonder if each goddess thinks of the other with something more complex than simple hatred. Perhaps they remember the void before creation, when they were so close they functioned as one consciousness, when opposition between them created possibility rather than destruction. Perhaps they mourn what they have lost, the companionship of the only being who shares their origin and power, the sister who became enemy through irreconcilable difference over whether to grant Chantia's plea for warmth and life. Or perhaps they feel nothing but the cold certainty that their war will continue until existence itself ends, until entropy claims even gods, until darkness and light finally cease their eternal struggle, because nothing remains for them to fight over. The eye cannot see into their hearts with certainty, but it watches them move through patterns established before history began, and wonders if beings so ancient even remember what unity felt like, or if conflict has become so fundamental to their identity that they could not exist without it. Section 5. Kelimver Lionsbane, the reluctant god of death. Some mortals become gods through ambition, through hunger for power so consuming that they orchestrate centuries-long schemes to achieve divinity. Others ascend through accident, through being in the right place at the right moment when cosmic necessity demands a new deity and no better candidate presents themselves. Kelimver Lionsbane belongs to neither category, yet encompasses elements of both. He became the god of the dead not because he sought such responsibility, not because circumstance randomly elevated him, but because love and curse and cosmic justice intertwined in ways that left him no choice but to accept a burden he never wanted and cannot set down. His story reveals perhaps the deepest tragedy among all the tales the whispering eye observes. The sorrow of a man who remembers mortality with perfect clarity, yet must judge the dead with divine impartiality, forever changed by the very ascension that freed him from the curse that had defined his mortal existence. You need to understand that Kelimver began as a mercenary, a sellsword who hired out his considerable combat skills to whoever could meet his price. He came from a family cursed generations past, the Lionsbane line marked by a supernatural affliction, whose origins traced back to the actions of a greedy ancestor named Kyle Lionsbane. Kyle had abandoned his wounded companion, a sorceress, on the battlefield, to die so that he could plunder an enemy's stronghold without sharing the spoils. As she lay dying, the sorceress whispered a death curse upon Kyle and all his descendants, transforming them into savage werepanthers if they ever acted purely for profit. The curse was meant to punish greed, to make the lionsbanes into monsters whenever they pursued wealth without honor. But curses are living things in their own way, and over the generations, this particular affliction twisted and changed, failing in some descendants while mutating in others. By the time 5 generations had passed and Kelimver was born, the curse had reversed itself entirely. Instead of transforming when they acted from greed, the lionsbanes now became beasts if they performed any act without demanding payment. If they showed kindness or compassion without receiving coin in exchange. The curse that began as punishment for selfishness became punishment for generosity, trapping Kelimver's family in a terrible bind. They could not help others from genuine compassion, could not show mercy or give freely, because freedom itself triggered the transformation into a mindless, violent creature of fur and fang. This man, this cursed mercenary, who had learned to harden his heart and treat every interaction as transaction, met a young mage named Midnight during his travels across Faerun. She was everything he had trained himself not to be. Hopeful, idealistic, willing to help others without calculating cost or benefit. Something in her presence called to the buried parts of himself he thought the curse had killed. The capacity for genuine feeling he had suppressed to survive his family's affliction. They traveled together alongside other companions, including Cyric, a thief from Gentle Keep, and Adon, a priest of Sune. Slowly, terribly, Kelimver fell in love with Midnight. He recognized the danger immediately. Love makes you vulnerable, makes you want to give without receiving, makes you act from compassion rather than calculation. Love threatened to trigger the curse, to transform him into the monster he feared becoming. But Midnight saw past his mercenary coldness to the decent man trapped beneath. She understood that his insistence on payment for every service came from necessity rather than greed, that the wall he had built around his heart was prison rather than fortress. She fell in love with him as well, with the person he might have been without the curse, with glimpses of tenderness he showed in unguarded moments before remembering to demand compensation. Their relationship existed in constant tension. Two people desperately wanting connection, while supernatural affliction ensured that genuine intimacy remained forever dangerous. What Kelimver did not know was that Cyric harbored feelings for Midnight as well, a desire that would later curdle into jealousy and hatred when she chose the cursed mercenary over the ambitious thief. The time of troubles changed everything, as it changed so much else in Faerun's history. When gods fell to earth and walked as mortals, when divine conflicts spilled into the material world with catastrophic consequences, Midnight found herself drawn into struggles between deities that no mortal should have to face. She witnessed Mystra's death at Helm's hands, saw the goddess of magic struck down for attempting to return to the heavens against Io's decree. The shock of that divine murder rippled through the weave and through Midnight herself, who had studied magic her entire life and could not comprehend a world where its keeper could be killed. Kelimver stayed at her side through the chaos that followed, protecting her from threats, both mortal and divine. His curse secondary to his desperate need to keep her alive. During this tumultuous period, something miraculous occurred. Bane, the tyrannical god of strife, walking the world in mortal form, lifted the curse from Kelimver. The reasons remain debated among scholars, perhaps a divine whim or part of some larger scheme, but the effect was immediate and profound. For the first time in his adult life, Kelimver could act from genuine compassion without fearing transformation. He could help others freely, could express love without calculation, could be the man he had always wanted to be beneath the curse's constraints. The liberation came at the worst possible time, during the greatest crisis the world had ever seen, but it was liberation nonetheless. When Io selected Midnight to become the new Mistra, to inherit the mantle of magic and all the terrible responsibility it carried, Kelimver felt her slipping away, even as he had just gained the freedom to truly be with her. She was ascending to godhood, leaving mortality and all mortal connections behind, becoming something so far beyond his reach that their love seemed a cruel joke played by cosmic forces. He watched her change, saw mortal woman becoming divine entity, felt the distance growing between them even as she tried to hold onto the person she had been. Midnight promised she would remember him, that ascension would not erase what they shared. And perhaps she meant it in that moment, before the weight of divine responsibility fully settled upon her consciousness. But the story did not end with Kelimver remaining mortal while his love ascended. Cyric, consumed by ambition and jealousy, also achieved godhood during the time of troubles, claiming the portfolios of multiple dead deities, including Baal, Merkle, and others. He became god of murder and death and tyranny, accumulating power and divine domains until his already unstable personality fractured under the weight. In his madness and spite, Cyric hunted down Kelimver, the rival who had won Midnight's affections. Using the sword Godsbane, Cyric killed his former companion, striking down the man who had once considered him friend. Death should have been the end for Kelimver, his soul departing to whatever judgment awaited those who die in the presence of gods. But Mask, the god of thieves and shadows, intervened in ways that remain mysterious even to divine scholars. He hid Kelimver's soul, concealing it from Cyric's awareness through means known only to himself. This hidden soul waited in a state between existence and oblivion, while the mad god's incompetence as Lord of the Dead became increasingly apparent. Sirik judged souls according to his paranoid delusions, condemning the innocent and rewarding the guilty based on whims only he could understand. The fugue plane where souls awaited judgment became a realm of chaos and injustice, the faithful suffering alongside the wicked, because Sirik could no longer distinguish between them. The situation could not continue indefinitely. Io, the overgod who maintains balance among all deities, recognized that death itself was being mismanaged, that one of the most fundamental aspects of reality had fallen into the hands of a deity too mad to fulfill his responsibilities properly. The solution proved both elegant and cruel. Io stripped the portfolio of death from Sirik, removing that domain from his accumulated powers and reducing his divine responsibility to something more manageable for his damaged mind. But death required a keeper. The cycle of mortality and afterlife needed a god to judge souls and maintain the balance that gave mortal existence meaning. Io selected Kelemver's hidden soul, elevating the dead mercenary to full divinity, transforming him from murder victim to the new lord of the dead. The ascension was not reward for virtue or compensation for suffering. It was cosmic necessity, finding an appropriate soul and drafting it into service regardless of its own desires or readiness. Based on what we know of his character, Kelemver never sought godhood, never wanted the responsibility of judging all who die. But the choice was not his to make. He became Lord of the Dead in an instant of transformation that granted him power and awareness beyond mortal comprehension, while simultaneously ensuring he could never return to the simple life he had wanted. Kelemver inherited Merkul's responsibilities and domain, taking up the burden of judging every soul that entered the fugue plane, deciding their eternal fate based on their actions in life and their devotion to whichever deity might claim them. The work was endless, the weight of each decision crushing, the knowledge that he determined whether souls experienced eternal reward or punishment, creating pressure that would shatter lesser beings. But Kelemver was no longer a lesser being. He was a god, and gods endure what they must regardless of personal cost. The curse that had defined his mortal existence vanished with ascension. The supernatural affliction unable to follow him into divinity. He could finally feel compassion without transformation, could show mercy without triggering bestial rage, could embrace the kindness he had been forced to suppress for his entire mortal life. But the freedom came too late and cost too much. What good was liberation from the curse when he had already died and been elevated beyond mortality? When the woman he loved existed on the same divine plane, but separated by responsibilities and nature that made relationship increasingly difficult. Mistra served magic and the weave. Kelemver served death and judgment. and though they tried to maintain connection in the early years of their dual divinity, the strain of divine responsibility pulled them apart. They supported each other in various ways, worked together on matters that required cooperation between magic and death. But the easy intimacy they had shared as mortals proved impossible to sustain as gods. The final break between them came over a dispute about the soul of their former companion Adon, who had been a priest serving Mistress Church. When Adon died, he did so having lost his faith, no longer believing in the goddess he had once served. Kelemver, bound by the principles of his divine domain, refused to send Adon's soul to Mistra because he had died faithless, no longer devoted to the deity who should have claimed him. Mistra argued that Adon deserved to come to her realm regardless, that his years of faithful service outweighed his moment of doubt at the end. The dispute grew bitter, revealing how far they had both traveled from their mortal identities, how divine duty had transformed them into beings who could no longer compromise or see past the requirements of their portfolios. Though Adon was eventually accepted into Mistra's realm, the argument created a rift between the two deities that never fully healed. The cruelest aspect of Kelemver's divinity lies in his perfect memory of mortality. Most gods who ascend gradually lose touch with human experience, their mortal memories fading or becoming so distant that they can no longer truly empathize with human concerns. Kelemver retained complete clarity about what it meant to be mortal, to fear death, to love and lose and grieve. He remembered the curse that shaped his personality, the hardness he had cultivated to survive. The brief period of freedom after Bane lifted the affliction. The love he shared with Midnight before gods and cosmic forces tore them apart. That memory informed every judgment he made, granted him empathy for the souls standing before him. But it also made the work more painful because he understood exactly what his decisions meant for the consciousness experiencing them. He judged fairly where Cyric had judged madly, establishing clear principles for determining souls' afterlives based on their actions and faith rather than divine whim. The fugue plane stabilized under his stewardship, becoming a realm of justice rather than chaos. Kelemver became known as the most fair death god in Faerun's history, neither cruel nor overly merciful, weighing each soul according to its true nature rather than surface appearances or desperate final pleas. His clergy taught that death was natural transition rather than punishment, that all mortals would eventually stand before their judge, that living with integrity mattered more than elaborate funeral rites or last-minute conversions. But fairness and justice, admirable as they are, provide cold comfort to a being who never wanted divinity in the first place. Kelemver performs his duties with dedication born of understanding that death requires a god, that souls need judging, and the cycle must continue. But one can infer he takes little joy in the work. Every soul he sees reminds him of his own mortality lost, of the life he could have lived if cosmic necessity had chosen someone else for ascension. He watches mortals who died in love's embrace, separated from partners they will not see again, until those partners also die and face judgment. And perhaps he remembers Midnight's face as she transformed into Mistra, remembers his own helplessness as she slipped beyond his reach into divinity that eventually claimed him as well, but too late, and in wrong way for reunion to be possible. When Mistra died the third time, murdered by Cyric with Shar's assistance, and the spell plague erupted across the world, Kelimver found himself in the position of judging countless souls who had died in magical catastrophe. The irony could not have escaped him. He stood as Lord of the Dead, processing millions killed indirectly by the murder of the woman he had loved, powerless to prevent her death or the cascade of destruction it triggered. This could imply a particular bitterness to that period of his divine existence, watching the consequences of Cyric's madness and Shar's hatred play out in the endless stream of souls arriving for judgment. Each one a reminder that even gods cannot protect what they love from cosmic forces beyond their control. The Whispering Eye observes Kelimver with deep recognition of tragedy, seeing in him the ultimate expression of duty overriding desire, responsibility consuming identity, cosmic necessity crushing personal will. He never wanted to be a god. He wanted to break his curse, to love freely, to live a simple life with the woman who had seen past his mercenary coldness to the decent man beneath. Instead, he became Lord of the Dead, spending eternity judging souls while remembering with perfect clarity what it felt like to be the one facing judgment, to fear death, to hope for mercy from powers beyond mortal control. His tragedy lies not in cruelty inflicted or happiness denied, but in the gap between who he was and what he became, the fundamental incompatibility between the mortal man who loved a mage and the god who judges all mortals with perfect fairness, but cannot help the one person he ever wanted to save. The pattern emerges when you consider all the stories the Eye has shown you tonight. Bhaalspawn created as vessels for their father's resurrection, tools serving purposes they did not choose. Servok reaching for godhood only to fail repeatedly, forever hungry for transcendence that recedes with each grasping attempt. Mistra dying repeatedly because her essential nature attracts assassination, serving faithfully while knowing service likely ends in violence. Shar and Selune locked in eternal opposition, primordial sisters separated by irreconcilable differences over the very creation they achieved together. Kelimver elevated to divinity he never wanted, becoming judge while remembering what judgment felt like from the other side. These are the whispers the Eye shares, the quiet tragedies of divine betrayal, forbidden unions, cosmic schemes that use individuals as components in plans they cannot comprehend or resist. You have listened well through this long exploration of divine lore and sorrowful revelation. The whispering eye sees you now as you see it. Consciousness meeting consciousness across the boundary between story and listener. What have you learned from these tales of demigods and divine betrayal? That power offers no protection from suffering. That cosmic schemes care nothing for individual happiness, that the burden of divinity weighs heaviest on those who remember what it meant to be merely mortal. All of these and more, the lessons layering upon each other like sedimentary rock, each story adding depth to understanding that divine existence carries tragedies mortal minds can barely comprehend. The eye does not judge what it observes, does not declare whether gods deserve their suffering or mortals their manipulation. It simply watches, records, and occasionally whispers to those willing to listen in the quiet hours, when darkness makes truth easier to bear than light. These stories continue, cycles repeating with variation, but never truly ending. Somewhere a ball spawn may yet live, carrying fragments of murder in their blood. Servak still harbors his hunger for godhood that may never be satisfied. Mistra tends the weave, knowing another death likely approaches. Shar and Selune continue their eternal war across millennia. Kelemver judges souls while remembering the mercenary he used to be. The cosmic wheel turns, gods and demigods caught in patterns older than civilization, playing out dramas that began before history and will likely continue long after the last mortal draws breath. The whispering eye closes now, its vigil complete for this night. But it never truly sleeps, and when you are ready to listen again, it will open once more to share the sorrows and secrets that gods would prefer remained hidden in darkness. Until then, rest well knowing that you have glimpsed truth most mortals never perceive, that the divine realm holds tragedy as profound as any mortal suffering, that sometimes the cruelest fate is getting exactly what cosmic forces designed you for, regardless of what you wanted for yourself.